We are going to get started with Dr. Jessie Mumm, a lifelong resident, ethnographic anthropologist extraordinaire.
I don't think I need that. Am I loud enough?
You're doing it.
Are you loud enough?
Yeah.
Good. So I've been doing this for quite some time. I love talking about Logan Square. I love this community. Been here since 1979. It is sad that we play these legitimacy games, isn't it? Mm-hmm. We do. We go, I've been here. How long have you been here? What's important is that we build community. And so I'm so glad you're all here, because that's what you're doing right now. So I would just like to do a 20-minute presentation on what I'm calling kind of the prehistory of gentrification. I am a resident who grew up here, but I'm also somebody that went into cultural anthropology. I made my study a study of gentrification in Chicago. I took 2 years of my life to talk to people all over the city, including Logan Square. I ended up doing a project that looked at Humboldt Park, Garfield Park on the west side, and Pilsen, which are all gentrifying in different ways. And so that longer project is the book you're going to be buying in a year or two. But for right now, I'm just going to present to you a little bit about what I discovered in the historical archive. So, inventing an inevitability, the prehistory of gentrification in Chicago. Beautiful quote here by Nelson Alderman. Have you ever read Chicago, City on the Main? Story of the entire history of Chicago. So let me blow your mind by starting with some people called the Métis. You're not going to see them at all, but I'm going to talk about them. So first of all, next slide.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Amy.
Oh, sorry.
I call this, what is my motivation? So there I was, Darwin School. Yeah, now you can see how old I am. Can you find the little white boy on the floor? There's only one other white kid there, the big, huge Polish guy in the middle. Everybody else that I ever knew in this photo have left the neighborhood. Every other one of those people. Where do they live? Well, some of them went to the suburbs, the inner ring, poor suburbs, right? Franklin Park. Some of them just moved further west, further northwest. Some of them left Chicago altogether, moved to Central Florida. If you can't get the right kind of job or the right kind of education in Chicago, you might as well go somewhere where the property value is lower, right? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's the deal that was presented to my generation in this neighborhood. It's a sad deal, and we need to change it. So anyway, ding. This is what we're going to go through today. I just want to start off by just saying, if you talk to anthropologists, archaeologists especially, who look at the entire history of cities, and I won't bore you with that, but I teach a course on it, we've been gentrifying since we created cities. The Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, present-day Iraq. You can see that the inner city, where the temple complexes were built, where the rich occupied huge estates, underneath those are the tiny walls of little hovels that were once built there when the city was first built. Where did those people go? They got pushed out, right? How did they do it? Was it like this today? Of course not. But something like this has been going on since we've had cities. Now in Chicago, in 1837, when we actually chartered this city, we actually had roughly, the estimates are 1/4 to 1/3 mixed race population. Who were these people? Anybody know?
Native Americans?
They were French mostly and Indian. And they lived here. They owned the inns, they owned stores. They hosted theater groups, kind of like what we're doing right now. They had control over trade. They were bartenders. They had stores, they had homes. Beaubien, that was one guy's name. These people were forced out, pushed out, bribed out in 1837 because the U.S. had signed a treaty with the Potawatomi, the Sauk, and the Fox saying you were to move past the Mississippi. These people were pushed out of Chicago as Chicago was chartered, as it was turned into the seat of Cook County, and then property value went through the roof. The same places those people were pushed out of, which are now right along the river, right in downtown, Those places doubled in value, tripled in value, quadrupled in value. Within 10 years were the basis of the original wealth of Chicago. Before there was a hog industry, before there was even a lumber industry, before there was any industry at all here producing anything for this great industrial Chicago, people made fantastic money off of flipping property. That was the basis of the capital of the city of Chicago. Now, what happens after that? Basically, we also set a new racial regime, which says, if you're Indian, you have to leave. And when you leave, property value goes up. Keep that one in mind. Let's keep going. So, this is my rough estimation, I hope it's readable for you, of kind of the timeline I'm talking about throughout the 20th century. So, what exactly happens has a lot to do with race, and a lot to do with urban development. By roughly the Second World War, which is kind of where I'm going to really pick this story up, what you have is the original housing stock of Chicago, which was built 1870s, 80s, 90s, turn of the century, is starting to deteriorate. It's happening in Logan Square in the 40s and 50s. This is without any population that was noticeably black or Latino in this neighborhood. Already the buildings are starting to sag. It's been 50 years, right? So what basically starts to happen is that we follow a pattern in Chicago that's a little different from other places in the world. There's so much open prairie that as soon as property starts, you don't fix your property, why bother? There's new land, right? So people just keep pushing outwards. Then we build the bungalow belt, right, on the edge of the city, and then of course the outer and then the inner ring suburbs. So all of that is going on as people are migrating into Chicago. The Great Migration, of course, of black folks from the South to Chicago starts around World War I. There's a second major wave in World War II that some people will say keeps on going actually up until the early 70s. So this is a huge migration of people. Black people are still outnumbering white people and Latinos in Chicago. And for as long as the majority of the 20th century were the largest group in this city, they are also the only group that has experienced a major decline in the last 20 years. 200,000 black people have left Chicago. Why? So, all of that is starting to happen. There's Mexican migration coming in the 20s because, of course, there's a revolution going on down in Mexico. As we're building some of the rail lines that come into the city, Mexican workers are following them into the city, living in boxcars, actually, on the west side and on the southeast side. Puerto Rican migration, of course, starts majorly in the late 40s. It's recruited migration. Castle, Barton, and Associates brings Puerto Ricans to Chicago to actually do housework, office work, pipe fitting, all those kinds of things. That was officially recruited migration. What do Latinos do? What do blacks do in Chicago? They essentially plug up the industries that are already deindustrializing so that the owners of those industries essentially don't lose out as much. But they are considered by the rest of the city population to be an extraneous population that is not wanted or needed. They take the oldest housing in the inner city, of course. Now, at that time, even from that time, black scholars started investigating the black South Side. Latino scholars like Elena Padilla start looking at where are Puerto Ricans moving? I mean in the 40s and 50s. And they're seeing what the city, real estate developers, and planners have in mind for the inner city in the 40s. And what is that? Slide. This amazing quote, when I was just still a graduate student, blew my mind. Anybody read Black Metropolis? Anybody? A couple people? Okay, good. Black Metropolis, of course, is considered a classic, 1945. University of Chicago, two black scholars look at the original black belt on the south side, a tiny, narrow, 6-block wide passageway in which black people were allowed to live without, of course, being discriminated against. That area becomes the subject of a major book. Their housing chapter concludes with this really interesting quote. What does this sound like? Chicago's master plan calls for the eventual reclamation of the inner city with a garden belt, privately financed. The state won't be involved in it. Medium rental apartments replaced in slums. Here it is hoped members of the new middle class will make their homes close to the loop where they work and well within the city limits. The blighted areas will thus be reclaimed. This is when urban renewal is launched, right? Now, what is urban renewal? First of all, in the 30s, under FDR, and of course, some of the programs that came out of the Great Depression, we create the very first public housing. That is, the idea that the government might be responsible for ensuring that people aren't living on the street is first sort of surfaced. We have dispensed with that idea, right? In the last 10 years especially. But anyway, that idea had caught on, and by the 40s, municipalities around the country were essentially coming up with something like what eventually became public housing. At first, it was considered wonderful, right? Places that had been deteriorating were knocked down, beautiful new places were put together, and interestingly enough, Chicago's very first public housing was segregated for whites only. Did you know that? Freaky. Some of the only places in Chicago that were built, became racially integrated, and stayed racially integrated are right here in our backyard, lakefront homes. Does everybody know that too?
Yep.
Yeah. Some people here are part of that battle, which is awesome. So anyway, but the idea of what the city wanted to do was already there. Ruth Glass says the gentrification 20 years after this, right? Let's keep going. So what you have is a series of bodies that were put together, reports put together, legislation from the 40s up until the early 70s that basically say what urban renewal is. Now I'm just as much a conspiracy theorist as probably many of you are here, but I want to be clear about something. If you go into the archives, these boring reports and memos that people have with each other, and I have a stack of this I've just thrown all over my dining room yesterday. If you look through this stuff, you'll see that these people didn't have any one cohesive idea on how to do this, how to repair the inner city. But I will say this, and this is an article that's coming up by me, what basically happened was that a conversation started in the 30s and 40s on how to repair buildings, streets, sidewalks, and parks. But by about 20 years later, that conversation had shifted into how to get certain people out of the neighborhood and bring in other people. And that's a very, very crucial distinction. Are we repairing buildings so that the people in the community can occupy them, or are we simply getting rid of those people and bringing in other people with money? That becomes the basis of the idea of gentrification from the 60s on. Now something else needs to be understood. We tried many, many different things. Somewhere in there, I'm not going to remember exactly which one. As the Department of Urban Renewal is consolidated by the city in the early 50s, they try several things, and one is receivership. The city still has this as a possibility, just like eminent domain exists as a law. The city can take over receivership of a building. Has anybody had that happen to them? No? Anybody heard of it around them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? What was it?
Oh, usually it's for building code violations.
Right.
But
The idea when it was introduced in the early 50s was if any building had 5 or more code violations, the city would step in, be the receiver of all the rents for the whole building. You would effectively lose temporarily your property rights to that building as a punishment for having run that building into the ground. The city then does all the repairs immediately, so it's not in violation, then collects rent until the exact amount of money that all the repairs cost is paid off, and then hands you back your building. It's sort of like, you can't take care of your stuff, we're gonna fix it and give it back to you. Doesn't that sound beautiful? That wouldn't have cost the city a dime. We can't afford to improve neighborhoods. That wouldn't have cost us anything. Has anybody driven through Garfield Park and seen an entire block with one building left standing? We spent our tax money to destroy buildings and haul them away, which costs hundreds of thousands, costs more than it costs to build a new building. And we did that with our tax money to destroy neighborhoods so they would be ripe for speculation. Why did we do that? Because the Chicago Real Estate Board very closely, seriously planned this. Now again, conspiracy theories aside, there's nothing conspiracy theory to say certain people have an interest in making money and it's an industry, right? From the 50s and 60s on, they basically opposed anything like receivership, like simply subsidies for repair, that might actually have just solved problems of abandonment. Because the problem wasn't just the abandonment, the problem was the people there. Next one. So this has sort of become famous, especially among people like us who are conspiracy theorists. By the early 60s, and then officially in 1973, you have something called Chicago Plan 21. plan for the redevelopment of the inner city areas. It's hard to even find this guy anymore. I looked in the University of Chicago library and finally found one. This plan is very, very vanilla if you actually look at it. It doesn't mention race. It really doesn't even mention class, barely. It looks like a bunch of pretty photos of places that look redeveloped. Kind of like when people here in this room go to some huge meeting that they're sponsoring about how to redevelop the land right next to the train station. I mean, nothing that anybody proposes isn't viable, right? It's just a matter of who's going to be able to live there and who's going to be able to afford it, and who is it by implicit non-statement kicking out, right? The Chicago 21 plan basically said we're going to redevelop all these areas. But redevelop meaning increase the property value. So, what did that actually mean? What did that actually do? Well, it spurred a huge amount of organizing around the city in various communities. Next slide. I want to just interject this. At the time, and in the process of creating the Chicago 21 plan, people were actually much more honest about the community that they wanted to build. And at the Chicago Real Estate Board, you could get away with saying things like this in 1962. You might have gotten away with saying it even up until the mid-70s. After that, our racial discourse starts changing, especially in the 80s. We start sublimating the ability to actually point to what we mean. Because, of course, we're not going to be honest about attracting white tenants into our neighborhood. Have you ever heard a real estate developer say that? No. What do they say? They say, good people.
Young professionals.
You know,
Yes.
people who take care of things. Not like the people that have been here for a while, right? So this is partly what I investigate, and partly what we'll talk about next Wednesday, is the discourses that people use to refer to race and refer to class without exactly sort of saying it out loud. I can't really cover all of what's happening in Chicago in such a short time, but keep in mind that while this is being put together, is the exact same time that white flight is happening, and of course property value is bottoming out in most neighborhoods around the inner city. But again, how it did and why it did is the subject of numerous books, Block by Seligman, Beryl Satter's Family Properties. They look specifically at Chicago and how we did this. Keep in mind, when black people moved to a block on the west side, on average, as that block became 100% black, the average income went up, the average educational level went up. Did you know that? The people that moved into the west side were on average higher income and better educated, and their property value plummeted. Now, does that make any sense? Is that the free action of the economy? No. Is that what, classic economic scholars would point to and say, well, of course, they tore their neighborhood up? No, they didn't. They very didn't. They planted flowers. And for the first 20 years of Garfield Park as a black community, it should have skyrocketed in value, and it didn't. Because, of course, realtors were buying homes, blockbusting, scaring white people. Those white people all sold. If anybody sells anything, of course, all at once, the property value drops, right? But the prices that black buyers were paying, of course, on contract sales, because they were redlined out of getting credit in those neighborhoods, were enormously high. But again, what sets property value? What the white market wants, at least in Chicago. So again, the racist history of how we devalued property is an ingredient that we have to keep in mind anytime we're talking about gentrification today. Now, what happened to the Latino community, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, was analogous, not as severe as what happened to the black community, but very, very close. Logan Square, when I was a kid, still had white people. But they hadn't all fled the way they did in Garfield Park. In Garfield Park, if you were a black family moving onto a block, within about 3 months, that block was majority black. Try to imagine that today. That is intense. How long has it taken to gentrify Logan Square? It started in the late 80s when I was here. So it's not something that happened overnight. When we were getting high in the vestibules of apartment buildings on Kedzie, where people like you guys now live, and getting chased out by the cops as teenagers, we were laughing about it. We thought, this many people aren't going to want to move from Lincoln Park across the river. We're too far west. But there's nothing that's too far west, or north, or south, or anywhere, right? It's just a matter of where you can create a market. And people, unfortunately, like Mark Fishman, figure that out in the 80s. So, let's keep going. So across the city, there was a massive backlash against the official plans by the city, which looked to people a lot like plans for displacement, right? But this was official, this was talked about. You want to say?
5 more minutes.
Okay, good. So basically they were saying at the time, we are coming for you, we're coming for your house. And so the Pilsen Neighbors, Northwest Community Organization, that was the one around here, parts of Logan Square, parts of what's West Town, they basically were organizing against this in the late 60s and early 70s. They published things about this. They basically just said, we know there is a plan in effect to push you out of here. And look at this. I mean, this is 1971, I believe. You know, a sketch of Pilsen and the idea of somebody saying, atención familias de Pilsen, big business wants to move in on our neighborhood. Next slide. And so what I've tried to do in my own work, in my larger stuff, is to basically say, we rearranged the relationship between race and space in the city, between that era and this era. So under classical segregation, basically you have this idea that people of color come somewhere and then property value drops, right? And in this new idea, white people come in somewhere and property value rises. Now, there is a class dimension to this. I don't mean to sublimate that at all, but I mean to suggest that when people are talking about why value is going up, they don't necessarily see people's class or income. They do see people's faces. And I have talked to real estate developers who have said to me personally, as soon as 2 or 3 white kids are comfortable standing outside my building smoking, everybody's rent goes up $100. So they know what they're doing. And we, unfortunately, become, of course, pawns in that process. And so all of this is just to suggest we're moving towards a different way of operating race in the city. Now keep in mind, these two things are happening simultaneously. White flight is still happening in the city, on the southwest side and the northwest side. It's not as if these things are not interchangeable, but it's all about assigning value to white bodies and devaluation to Black and Latino bodies, regardless of anything else. So, next slide. I just want to end up with kind of a sort of a note of hope, actually. The U.S. federal government subsidized movement to the suburbs for whites. And in one generation, kind of built up a white middle class in the Chicago area. Now really, this was through direct intervention by the state. At the same time, of course, artificially devaluating other things. Now that means that this was never an inevitable process. This was not something that had to happen this way. And it took people 60 years, okay, to put together not just the conspiracy of the state and realtors, but the cultural idea that gentrification happens inevitably, which is something we keep repeating to each other. I want to just interject 2 little details and I'll sort of stop there. When Harvey Zorbaugh wrote something called The Gold Coast and the Slum a long time ago, looking at the North Shore, he has this little aside which I found brilliant. This is the 1930s and 40s, and he says, when artists start moving into a neighborhood, that's when you know everything is going down. Down. This was the common perception. This was the realtor's perception in the 1940s. When artists move into a neighborhood, you're bringing in people who don't produce anything, don't have kids, might be gay, do drugs, and cause public disruption by running around with their friends late at night drinking. Awesome stuff. Anyway, that's going to devalue an area. That was common sense until the late 60s, until Greenwich Village, until the Mission District, until other parts of the country were saying, let's just put the value wherever the artists go, right? So this is interesting. Artists feel like they're sort of caught up in this tangle. But if we decided that the value is going to go to any neighborhood where people start wearing blue, all we're talking about is the artificial association of value beyond what is actually about material improvement of buildings. Did you hear that? Mexicans in Pilsen fixed up their buildings at a rate far outstripping any European groups that had ever been there. From the late 60s to the early 80s, they rehabbed more buildings than any white people have ever done. Did property values zoom through the roof? No. It's not just about who puts on new paneling or new windows. It's about where we decide we're going to artificially inflate value. So again, I want to end up in a hopeful place because I say a lot of terrible things. Look at these kids. It used to be in Chicago that every single public park had a football team, and they all played each other, and they had a big, like, I don't know, Super Bowl at the end. And one park won every year. They ended this in the early 80s, I don't know why. So the Humboldt Park Colts were like a team. And I saw this picture in the archives, and my heart melted. Look at these guys. There's 7 black kids, 6 Latinos, and 9 white players. What I'm trying to just suggest is this. Even when people were more overtly racist, even when racism was in your face, even when people were yelling spick and honky and nigger and all that stuff when I was a kid, they were also in the same schools. Briefly, but briefly meaning 20 years. They were there in the same churches sometimes. They were there in the same stores. And the people I interview from that era, they tell me that it was a beautiful time for a second until the changes overcame complete, right? Unfortunately, we don't see this today. Unfortunately. We don't see people coming to Logan Square and getting as deeply, not everybody, some of you out here are awesome. But we don't see the same kind of thing of people saying, we're going to share the same institutions with you. We're going to shop in the same places. We're going to join the same organizations instead of forming separate, unequal, more powerful organizations to push for our own separate interests. If people did that, the way blacks and Latinos did when they first arrived in these communities, we could actually build an integrated, sustainable community. That's my hope, and that's my dream for Logan Square. Thank you.